I just want to introduce the poets really briefly, and then I'm going to get to our unique format that we do at One Pause, which is to ask the same questions of all of our visiting poets. We're not going to ask all the questions today because we want to talk about eco-poetics, which is a really important poetry movement, and part of our September events is to bring more attention to this movement. So just very briefly, Robert Haas's books of poetry include The Apple Trees, A Dilemma, New and Selected Poems, Time and Materials, Sun Under Wood, New Poems, Human Wishes, Praise, and Field Guide. He has co-translated several volumes of poetry with Milosz, and he is a former MacArthur Fellow, U.S. Poet Laureate, Pulitzer Prize winner, Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, and National Book Award winner. Brenda Hillman is the author of 9 books of poetry, including Practical Water, Bright Existence, Cascadia, and Loose Sugar. She has received many awards for her work, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Poetry Society of America, as well as a Pushcart Prize. She holds the Olivia Filippi Chair in Poetry at St. Mary's College in California. When I was a graduate student here many, many years ago, I discovered Brenda's work, and I loved it so much that I had to buy several copies of the book because it fell apart. I brought it everywhere, and it just fell apart. And then I was also reading Praise by Robert Haas, and I didn't even realize that you were married. And then when I did, it was really crazy. But I just want to say that poetry can really change your life, and both of these poets changed my life, so it's personally really wonderful to have them here. Anyway, so one thing, the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation has given us a grant to ask these very general questions. So we're going to start with a few very general questions. People are laughing maybe because they know these questions. The poets don't always like the questions. Okay, so it's okay to not like them. All right, so the first question is...
Do we say that we don't like
Sure, yeah, people have been really... Yeah. Clayton didn't like the questions at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we like Clayton.
Yeah, we like Clayton. So the first question is, what does it mean to make a poem?
Bob gets to start. I'm nervous about my mic here because it's doing... Is this audible?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So you don't have to be nervous.
Go ahead.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Sarah, for making this happen. Thank you, One Pause Poetry in the library. And thank you, Ann Arbor. God, what a beautiful day. We're coming from droughty California and getting to see a little change color, but also the intense green here just made me extremely happy this morning. So I love this question. They sent us the questions. Usually poets famously hate those questions. I don't know if any of you saw USA Today this morning, but there's an interview with Charles Wright, who's Brenda's teacher, and is now the poet laureate, and they asked him, why does poetry matter? And he said, well, I'm glad you asked, because I spent all summer in Montana thinking about it because I knew I would be asked, and my answer is I have no idea. The immediate thing about writing poems is that just after you've done it, you love it, or I love it. It's a very happy thing. I don't know, I'm sure short story writers and essayists feel the same way. To have written something that you liked for that short period where you get to like it before you start thinking about it is a very happy thing. So that, for me, that's the first meaning. And it made me think of, there's a theorist of children's art named Pia Lindström. Yeah. And the first sentence of her book about children's art is, the first pleasure of art is being a cause. Child making a line. And I think in the most primitive way, that's what I really love about having made a poem. My critic kicks in very quickly after that, but I have this little window, like the glimpse of paradise before you go into the bardo state, when I've just written a poem.
Yeah, so I took a look at the questions too, and I tried to think whether I liked them or not. But I don't know, to me, what does it mean to make a poem? the operant words are mean and make in that because meaning is such a troubled term now, you know, and we're supposed to deconstruct meaning or stand in the decentered universe and all that. But the fact is that we do come to art and to our making of art or our reading of art to parse out meaning from what we think of as inchoate or meaningless existence. And so for me, making meaning takes place in so many different ways, but definitely by gathering the sense that existence, we're in so many different levels of existence simultaneously, and we're in an unknown universe and in relation to our experience where we barely know what's going on. And so pausing in our perceptions with language, which is our most common tool, to do these precious things, and even if it's, you know, the Divine Comedy, it's very compressed universe, a poem is. So it means a lot to focus our language in what makes our experience meaningful. And I think poetry does that so well because it is our most common, it's our most common tool. It's more common than, you know, paint or music or dance, even though those are great disciplines. But, you know, you do feel like you use language every day. So making this freeze-dried form that's kind of magical because it's so compressed is a great privilege, even if you mess it up initially. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So the second question is, what is the role of beauty in a poem?
So I was thinking about beauty when I read Sarah's question, and I was scrolling back to 1986, I think it was. I raised a punk rocker, and he was making a band that became kind of a punk rock band of note. And when I first heard his tape, he put it in the tape cassette, and I thought, I didn't even recognize, I couldn't understand the words, and I couldn't understand the music at all. And it was not only not beautiful, I didn't get where it was in the universe of music that I knew, even rock music. And later, 20 years later, I grew to think that that was a beautiful sound. And I still think it's a beautiful sound. And I think beauty is a moving thing, and it's not one thing. And I take my origins of beauty from the British and American Romantic tradition through modernism to postmodernism and beyond. Now I think of postmodernism, and that all those traditions are very important, that romantic ideas of beauty, whether they're still operant or we're unraveling them all the time, are still really important. Even if we're mocking them in postmodernism. Mm-hmm. So I think beauty matters a lot, or what we think of as beauty, even if we're going to undo it as we go.
I wonder who devised that question?
Oh, it's a secret.
Because beauty is not at the moment part of the discourse about,
it's somebody, not a poet.
About art, which is kind of great. I was reading an essay by Rebecca Solnit, the California, and she just, talking about something else, remarks about beautiful people, that beauty seems to us a kind of answer, that you want to be next to it, whereas people who are beautiful, she said, are not necessarily particularly remarkable in any other way than that. So they don't feel like they have an answer, but they have the experience of people like. And it made me think that Keats had it right, that truth is beauty, that the same thing is true with meaning in a way. Mm-hmm. That people are terrifically attracted to meaning, which is why gurus and the people who give the lectures on PBS can attract people. You know, the meaning might be eat more vegetables, but you're drawn to it, you're attracted to it. So the combination of beauty and meaning, very mysterious, I think, and deeply attractive. I guess it was late 19th century, really, that beauty got to be thought of as an end in itself. And a lot of modernism is critique of that idea. So that made me think maybe it's time to revive the aesthetic tradition.
Well, I don't think it ever died in some way, but it gets reinvented.
I remember once reading a sentence in Time magazine that I always loved, which was sometime in the 60s, talking about a singer said, no one has cared so much about beauty since nobody in America has cared so much about beauty since Oscar Wilde, Lily and Anne plunged into the cultural night of Illinois. That was bringing aestheticism to the practical civilization of America. And made me think, maybe we need to start over here.
This next question is how do sound and it's actually image or vision intersect in your poems? And I think what I mean by that is the sound of the words versus, you know, a visual image, or it could even be the page as a space, a visual space. I guess I'm personally, whenever I ask this question, I want to know, like, what comes first for you? Is it a sound, or is it an image, or is it just the form, you know? Or are they all together?
Sound for me.
Well, I have to have some combination of an idea or something that matters. Back to the first question, something that matters, and maybe even a feeling about the universe that can't be put into language, and then some metaphoric or interesting form that I want to explore, but the igniting thing, like whatever ignites the spark for the poem for me, is always a phrase that will come and unbidden. And if it doesn't come, I feel like I'm in hell and that God hates me. But just because I grew up Baptist, but I know that whole thing has to be remade, and that's why I'm writing poetry anyway. But the idea that you're waiting for a sound and it has to be in that order is what poetry is about. It can't just be like, oh yeah, I mean, I play plenty. I'll write 300 drafts of something, and I know that I haven't got that little sound. And using Death Tractates as an example, like I was writing for 3 months, and I knew it was just a big mess. I had no sound. But then when the first line of the first poem finally came, I could write it, and then I wrote the whole book. But you know, it's that igniting thing,
Yeah.
and I think writers all feel that way. Many writers feel that way. That it's got to be that given, wherever it comes from. But it's tormenting to wait for it. Or
In that book, sorry, because that's my favorite book in the world, is in that book, it's so small, the poems. Did it come just like that with the little tiny lines and all the white space, you know? What you said, the sound just started that,
yeah,
and it just came out like that.
yeah, it did. Well, the first line.
A voice, anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
I watched that emerge. It's so gorgeous the way that.
Well, it wasn't about, finally, writing isn't as much about experience as getting the experience and the language to go on a date, you know, and to have them like Lamb, where they just love each other.
Right. Right.
Yeah, something like that.
I loved about all these questions is that they go kind of in a naive way to the heart of the matter. That I mean, finally, with poetry, for me, for sure, though fumblingly, it really does have to do with somehow finding the paradigmatic moment in which the idea or whatever it is you want to say and the sound fit, whatever fit is.
But it's often like right off to the side, like in, you know, just to use Tractates as an example, because I thought I was writing about the loss of my friend, and I wanted to write a poem to her, but it ended up being like a half sentence of the unacceptable thought that started the book, which was that the soul got to choose, which was the first thing that finally ignited being able, like the soul got to choose. Does it? Does the soul get to choose where it goes in the afterlife? What does that mean? Do I really believe in souls? But that was the demanding thing. So it's not the acceptable thing that'll start it. Sometimes it's the unacceptable thing off to the side, but it is based on the sound.
Right.
I think. Don't you think? I mean, for your writing?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it sounds like what you're saying is that this whole thing unspooled from that, almost like a stuff-it system or something, like it just, this whole volumes come out.
Yeah. Well, the whole idea of it'll come out of a
Right.
sound, like in seasonal works, it was between earth and its noun, I felt a fire. And I had no idea what that meant, but between earth and its noun, I felt a fire. Seemed like the place to explore the whole underground world of eco-knowledge or something like that. Yeah,
These lines, at the beginning of this book of poems, Death Tractates, the speaker in the poem has had a loss and is kind of stunned, and the voice is as if numbed. After great pain, a formal feeling comes, numbed, trying to remember what the deal is when you die. And the opening line is that the soul got to choose. Is that?
Nothing else got to.
And it's another thing about Thing Fit that I think I may not have it lettered perfect, but if you memorize something by accident, you know something is going on. That the soul got to choose. Nothing else did.
Nothing else got to, but the soul got to choose.
Nothing else got to, but the soul got to choose. That it was very wise, slipping
from light world to
light world to light world, like an egret fishing through its smeared reflection. Astonishing thing. And that's that thing, you get visited by a certain kind of music. And it goes into your head and it goes into other people's heads. That's primary magic.
And I think for me, when I read it as an undergrad, I mean, I was a grad student, but I was, I don't know, 23 or something. My friend had just died, and it just was everything that I was feeling, which is, I think, what poetry can do. And it just was, it was like ahead of me, you know. And then it was teaching me what's possible, but also emotionally it was ahead of me. So it was such a gift, you know, that's what I mean, it can change your life. And it was a lifeline in a way, to give words to that state that it was written out of, because you were writing from that state too, it seemed like, of grief, you know.
It's interesting because I don't think it necessarily has to be emotional. I mean, it can be, like I think of Bob's piece that he's sick of, but you know, I mean, the beginning of Meditation at Lagunitas, are you sick of it? All right, and I won't bring it up. But I mean, to me, that's like a blow-away great poem that you just sort of, wow, once you hear that, you think, how could there have been a time when that wasn't in the world?
On the plane, I was reading poems by Wyatt Prunty, who's a Southern poet and a kind of classicist, conservative by our sense of thing. And he writes in fairly strict iambic pentameter and about very ordinary subjects in that kind of wry way. But in this particular poem, it's a teenage boy who's gone to see Frankenstein, comes back, makes some reference to his father. The father says, it's probably too anatomical for you. And the son says, what does anatomical mean? And the father sighs and goes up to the attic and gets a Gray's Anatomy to bring down. And the mother comes into the dining room where they're sitting and says, you're not going to give him that lesson now, are you? And she says, well, he's about that age. He says to her, kind of, well, he's about that age. And she said, well, a book like that? And the kid says, I think I'll go on up to bed. In perfect iambic pentameter. Imagine a 14-year-old watching his parents argue about sex education, and then, I think I'll go on up. It's genius, on up to bed. Well, it's tetrameter, isn't it? Iambic tetrameter. But that on up, I thought, made me fall in love with this business of the music of poetry fitting perfectly.
Well, maybe now let's move to a discussion of ecopoetics, which is, and if we have time, we can come back to a question about translation. But, I mean, I would like to know, just from both of you, how you would what is it, ecopoetics? I mean, no, that's another really broad question, but just take a stab at it, because I think there are a lot of people here, there's some people here who might not know about it.
I love the question, like, what is a poem, you know? And
yeah.
So Bob had a great answer one time. He said, well, when you go into a bookstore and you go over to the section that's called poetry, and you take any of those books, that's poetry. So I sort of think ecopoetics, there are 2 or 3 great new anthologies, Black Nature by Camille Dungy, which is a fantastic, and Eco-Poetry Anthology, Ann Fisher Worth and Laura Gray Street, and Arcadia Project, G.C. Waldrop and Josh Corey, and those 3 make up really a wonderful, and there's another one coming out from Jonathan Skinner. Those 3 make up really great places. Like, you walk into any of those anthologies, that's eco-poetry. We don't have to define it now. But for me, it definitely has the component of building on, you know, whatever nature poetry is. You can't throw out that term or that basis. But it definitely has the sense that we're in a site of discussion, and this term comes from Jonathan Skinner, actually, in an interview that he did. He said, it isn't a thing or a discipline, it's a site of discussion. And I think the site of discussion for ecopoetics that builds on the nature poetry tradition has to do with knowledge that we no longer turn to nature for solace. We turn to the sense that we're on Earth in a set of relationships that are perhaps troubled, or that we have to rethink, and that we have to rethink our humanness in relation to the non-human, not just plants, animals, rocks, but parking meters and roads and whatever else we include in remade nature. And so to me, it does have the idea of an agitated discipline, of a relationship to the non-human that is not easy. The way, you know, Wordsworth would go to nature to hear, like, he's getting mother's milk. You know, he's getting to hear that thing that's going to fill him up again. And poor Coleridge went to nature to sort of, wait, I want to hear, I want to feel mother's milk, but I'm not sure I can. But now, as poets, we don't go with that sense of, you know, here I am, out in the mountains, feeling good. We go with a heavy heart sometimes. We still go with joy and pleasure and, you know, to make our poems. But we go with a whole different sense of relationship. So that's how, and mine are, my poems in relation to the non-human are very based in the sense that we can still bring a very radical sense of spirituality to our encounters with the natural world, even if we've really made a huge mess. And that maybe our spiritual lives can be not cataclysmically damaging to that. So I don't know. That's at least part of what I go with it, but yeah.
Good answer. To follow up the answer for the question of what is ecopoetics for readers, there is a journal started by a young poet named Jonathan Skinner called Ecopoetics that is worth looking at for thinking about this. And there are these 3 recent anthologies. One of them is an anthology, historical anthology of African-American nature writing, black nature. Another is this one called the Eco-Poetry Anthology, which I contributed a 70-page essay explaining what eco-poetry was. The upshot of which was Brenda said, if you ever write another introduction, I'm divorcing you.
So it came 2 introductions after that.
I wrote 2 after that, so she didn't really. And the third is this one called
Arcadia Project. Yeah.
For the young writers here, the thing to say, I guess, is my version of saying what you're just saying is suddenly everything's ecopoetics because the crises that we are all aware of living with have made us aware of a bunch of other things, including the fact that at some level, what we think we know about the universe from some 19th, 20th, and 21st century science still is not necessarily reflected in our poetry very much. And a shorthand for this would be that Robinson Jeffers could write poems saying, well, human beings may have their wars and stuff, but nature is eternal. While we don't feel that anymore, we can't feel that in the same way. And the short version of the reasons are climate change, which means we have a whole energy system, economic energy system, that we've now passed on to the developing world that is not sustainable. And that we can't turn around because we have too much money invested in doing it the way we're doing it now. And we don't even know about that. I mean, I remember, some of you guys are young for this, but when George Bush and Dick Cheney were elected, the evident fact to me was that you had an oil guy from Texas and an oil guy from Wyoming locking into place this energy system. And it wasn't even an issue in the campaign at the time. And Al Gore shut up about the environment because he didn't think he'd get elected talking about it. And we got 25 or 30 more years of absolutely destructive policy, including oil wars that we've gotten into that we're still playing out at $10 million a day. I read this paper this morning for the drone attacks in Syria. So there's that connected to the fact that our fundamental energy system, that is to say our economic system since the Industrial Revolution, doesn't work. And we can't change it, or seem not to be able to change it. And it's extraordinarily destructive. Second thing is we're beginning to look like we can't feed people, which has to do with shortage of water and shortage of soils for the future, and an agricultural system that doesn't make sense, and that leaves half the world in hunger while the other half eats unhealthily. I mean, this is not controversial to say, right? It's not working. And most of our solutions to it are very unpredictable. The use of genetic modification as a technology, terrifically. And then the third thing is the loss of biodiversity, the shrinking of the gene pool, which is one of the things we do know from 20th century science, from Darwin, 19th century science, is that the core of life is the variety, diversity, and creativity of the gene pool. And human genius is to simplify all of those things, to reduce them to our needs. Take the prairies of the Middle West and grow nothing but corn and soy on them for 100 years, pouring more and more nitrogen onto them so that you get dead zones in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. We know we're doing all of this stuff. We know it's crazy. There's practically no discourse about it. It's very slowly changing, and you can't write poetry about loving the natural world anymore. You're generation younger than us without being aware of this stuff. And so hence, all poetics have become eco-poetics. It doesn't matter what you're writing about.
So it kind of takes back to the second question about beauty, like how do you relate beauty to this, what seems like an ethical crisis? I mean, I would say, I'd still argue for beauty and meaning, but just having to be on multiple levels as human beings and as poets and as readers and as experiencers, and not just one or two, you know? I mean, you can't go merely for solace, but you certainly can go to art for some kind of, you know, meaning-making experience. It's just radical, and it's more layered, and it's more troubled and polyvocal and polyformal, and it's not just one thing. The way the the romantics are great. We still have to read them in relation to it. But I don't know. Is that helpful?
Oh, it's really helpful.
Yeah, I don't know if people have like, if it's a totally baffling term, it's sort of like eco-poetics, but it's still a pretty strange term.
The thing that had made me feel uneasy about the term eco-poetics was my uneasiness about the genre of nature writing in relation to this crisis, because it ends up always being an advocacy literature. And when thinking we might talk about this, in getting on the airplane, I got out Keith's poems and Linda Greger's poems and Theodore Rithke's poems, who I think of as the Aboriginal Michigan nature poet, growing to think out loud about it. And I found myself thinking about the fact that for us, the argument you want to make against to get people to change is an appeal in some form or another to the beauty of nature. And the beauty of nature for us has become a weekend recreational activity. Weekend invented by the Industrial Revolution, which also invented the mess that we've got ourselves in. So we're supposed to save ourselves from the mess we got ourselves in by having beauty on the weekend, and having state parks which are for having beauty on the weekend and on the 2-week vacations that people in industrial societies get, except us, we academics, figured out that there's a way you can make a living and get 3 months off, which is a start on an intelligent relationship to all. Imagine if we had a society in which everybody had all summer off. And there's kind of stores shut down, manufacturers shut down, everything shut down, because at the religious center of our life was having a good time and finding spiritual meaning. That would be an eco-poetic revolution. And so what we're left with, really, thinking about it, is the benefits of the glimpse of the moment when we see meaning, which is to say, see beauty, which is to say, see the trees just starting to turn in green Ann Arbor, and thinking, oh my God, I'm alive on earth. Gratitude and beauty and meaning kind of bunched up. And poets can iterate it over and over again, and the steamrollers keep going.
I taught an eco-poetics class at St. Mary's where I teach, and I had a group of undergraduate men, sports people, and they turned out to be amazing poets, and they were great because they came into the class thinking that weeds were bad. Like if you call something a weed, you spray Roundup on it. And they got kind of agitated at the idea that maybe weeds weren't bad. And then we read Jonathan Skinner's third space essay, and it turns out that weed might be a human construct. You slap the word weed on something, and so we talked about weeds for two 3-hour classes. And then we went out and looked at weeds and talked about, like, which ones had they called weed in our lawn and which ones aren't weed. And it was completely illuminating. I mean, some of them were still like, okay, we still need our Roundup, but that was such an interesting thing, just to talk about one word for 2 days. And so, I mean, I think the thing that writers can do is always bring it back to language and how we use language and how we redo it and refresh it for people. So it's not all, you know, terrible news, although Bob and I still sort of, I think if they do the Keystone, I'm really determined to do civil disobedience insofar as my time allows. I can't do jail time, but I can do some civil disobedience, and I think that writers are not exempt from getting our butts out and doing activist things in addition to writing, because that's different from poetry. The legislators don't really read poems, although you can get them to read poems. Actually, you can get them to wake up a little bit. Maybe people have.
This gets to the subject of Brenda's idea of political action, which is kind of private. I think on one side of the family you're descended from Martin Luther, and on the other from John Calvin. Anyway, she, as a political act, moans at the gas pump. She's written a poem about moaning at the gas pump, on the theory that what we really ought to do is go into mourning for, not only for, well, maybe you should explain your theory of moaning at the gas pump.
Well, I mean, I feel like the mass, I think the mass march that happened on Sunday is amazing and important, and I hope people participate in things like that and visit legislative offices and all. But I also think private acts of resistance and sort of anarchic disobedience, you know, what if everyone in the country, obviously we have to cut down our use of fossil fuel and have solar and reusable and all of that, but what if we all just started moaning every time we pumped, you know, instead of just doing it automatically or occasionally feeling guilty for not riding our bikes or something. I tried to get Bob to moan, and he did moan once. It was so dear. I videoed it. Yeah. Like Bob's moaning. It was just like a soft moan.
She'll be happy to coach you after.
Yeah, it's not hard. It's embarrassing. It's very embarrassing. You just moan.
That naming thing is, I mean, it is worth mentioning that you know, that remains one of the jobs. I think of my friend. I co-teach an environmental course with an ecologist, and his definition of a native plant is the one that the white people first noticed when they came to North America is a native plant. And he defines a flood as people in a place where the water wants to be, and so on. That there are a lot, and you can do a similar thing with a drought is people using too much water in the place where they're living. There are a lot of ways of reframing our lordly sense of ownership of the planet.
It's amazing, though. I mean, just back to the weed thing. I took an old weed book to the kids, and it was a gorgeous book, and it was from the late 1940s. And practically everything we call a wildflower now in California was in the weed book. And they had various ways of like getting rid of these things and spraying and all that. But it was astonishing how the beautiful illustrations of these weeds and then how to exterminate them. And then scroll forward 30 years and they're all in the wildflower books.
That's,
You know?
yeah.
It's not a, you know, it's not like literary theory invention that these are cultural constructs that we come up with so we can dominate the earth.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to see if there were any, would you answer a question?
Sure,
if
of
there's
course.
A question
Yeah.
in the audience? Does anyone have a question?
I'm very interested in the construction of the concept of a movement around what's happening in eco-poetics and how that might be used for change or advocacy in other areas.
Of a movement?
Yes, I'm working in healthcare and I'm looking for models to adapt. I mean, there's so much that needs to be changed in healthcare, and I'm thinking of how did you design or develop, or how did the movement come to be? What makes it a movement? Where did it come from? How, you know?
This is so interesting. Could you hear? I have a question.
That idea of a movement of eco-poetics and what?
No, I don't know. It's an incredibly interesting question. How, whether there's any analogy between artistic movements and social movements, and if there's anything to be learned about modeling to get things going. You know, I think people of our generation thought, let's get things going, and then Occupy happened. And it felt for a while like something was happening, and the 300,000 people showed up on Sunday in New York for the climate change. Whether that's a one-off or a movement, and what what it would take. I mean, in the field of healthcare, one of the things that's happening is that the people who don't believe in evolution are being killed by it in hospitals because we're out evolving our antibiotics and making the places where healthcare happens dangerous places to go to. The crisis is going to occur to people at some point. And whether that will generate a social movement for change is so hard to know how that happens.
I guess in aesthetic terms, I have suspicion of movements in sort of like this movement is followed by that movement, and then the Black Mountain people, then so on, because it's first of all, it's exclusionary to say that I belong to a movement that then you have to pass through my gates and then take a test to be accepted in my movement. So I don't believe in like exclusionary senses of things, but I do think there are cultural tendencies that the arts then reflect and play into. That's why I love Jonathan Skinner's term, eco-poetics is a site rather than a movement, because I think it's a term that's useful for thinking about what happens in poetry to express this agitation in new forms, maybe more exploratory forms. So, I mean, if you're interested in it, I think you can find it in almost all disciplines, the sense that, environmentalism and this sense of how do we rethink our relationship to the non-human has to, enter a lot of conversations. I mean, to me, I was active in Occupy, and to me it's very tied up with economic destabilization of current systems, that it really we have to question the whole profit system at the core of our values. I mean, if things are going to change for humans. But I also think, like in the arts and the relationship to the sciences, that it's a very interdisciplinary way of thinking. We don't think of like poetry over here, and then we're having and then the scientists are having their conversation over here, and so on. I think there's a new sense that these disciplines really just do have to talk to each other, or they do.
What kind of movement do you imagine might happen in the field of healthcare?
Two things. One, what you were saying about the arts and the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
There's a series of events here on campus called the Mandorla about exactly that intersection between the sciences and the arts and the overlap and the collaborations. So movement, what I was interested in, there's an awful lot of activity for changing healthcare through social media, patient groups, patient collaboration, storytelling, lots and lots of storytelling, videos, art, all of this. But
Oh,
when
how interesting.
I was hearing about the eco-poetry movement, I'm going more, what's the role of poetry in fostering and creating social change? There is a Society for Participatory Medicine that looks explicitly at how patient engagement and collaboration with clinicians can help to foster real change.
Yeah.
I mean, there's often the question, I don't know if this was ever on your list, but so why is poetry so isolated? Like, why can't we get it more out there?
Yeah,
yeah,
that's the last question.
But I mean, most of us in this room, most of us in America started out writing poetry. That impulse gets killed out of us. It's not that it's isolated. It's that it's squelched. It's not, you know, it's not fostered. So what you're saying is that if there are places and ways that different disciplines can intervene to give the arts an opportunity to flourish, not in any one way, but in a generous kind of way, for people to produce and read an art, you know, even if it's, poetry is challenging, it's very compressed, sometimes you have to read it more than once. Oh, more than once for an American, whoa, I have to read something more than once? But you know, it's not an esoteric art, finally. So I think as a movement, environmental poetry is really pretty huge. I don't know. Do you think that?
I think poetry, I mean, all the arts reflect what's going on. Change, I mean, the thing I always want to say to students is, change does happen. As you know, I grew up in a country that had apartheid, and that changed. Situation of legal and human situation of women changed. We're watching right now a thing happening to prejudice about sexualities. That there actually is change. There's no reason to despair of its possibility. But exactly how to build poetry, sometimes is ahead of the curve, sometimes it just reflects what's going on. I think it's true with all of the arts. There's a period when painting is teaching people to see the world in a new way, time when the novel was, or theater was, or political philosophy was. You never know quite what the originator of change is, but we know that there is change, and that you can either be, as Bob Dylan used to say, part of the problem or part of the answer to the problem. And so a consciousness of what's going on is...
You just said the answer. How being involved in the arts, being engaged in the arts, being involved in poetry, telling the stories, being part of communicating it, is being part of the change, the act of fostering change.
Maybe so. One hopes.
Yeah, I think that we have to stop, sadly, but that's a good place to stop. And